After that, a problem came up. Who's in charge here? He got fired yesterday. He was the only one who could speak French. What? There was only one person who could solve the problem. Michael attempted to call him back, but my name is Brandon, and I'm 30 years old. I live a brilliant life as a bachelor, despite being in my 30s. My family home, where my brother and parents live, is about an hour's drive away. We have a good relationship, and I visit home once a month. I work in sales and have been with my current company for 6 years. When I first joined, there was so much to learn that I struggled every day. At one point, I was recognized for smoothly handling a client who only spoke French, and I became in charge of foreign clients. It seemed I was the only one in the office who could speak French at a native level, so naturally, my workload increased. Before I knew it, working overtime had become the norm for me. Although physically exhausting, I could keep going because my colleague Jason and others would help out, bring me snacks, and cheer me on. There's nothing I can do to help. I'm sorry you have to bear all this burden. Some coworkers apologized, showing concern for me. The workload was immense, but I felt blessed with good relationships. Knowing that my efforts were helping my colleagues gave me more motivation. In the end, I actually liked my job. One day, as usual, I was working overtime when my manager, Michael, came to me. You're working late every day. Don't tell me you're doing it on purpose to increase your overtime pay. Michael was a bit of an eccentric, and even his colleagues tended to keep their distance from him. It was always a bit of a hassle to deal with him. I wouldn't do that. It's just that I have so many calls to make that I can't finish during regular hours, I said. Michael frowned. Do you know what that's called? Incompetence, he said, snorting in a condescending manner. If I could, I'd love to go home on time and just relax, but my workload is double that of other employees. Additionally, some clients are in different time zones, and it would be rude not to call them during their daytime hours, so working overtime is inevitable to manage my workload. I'm sorry, but to avoid causing trouble to other employees, please let me continue a bit longer. I apologized politely. Michael left with a click of his tongue. I wondered what Michael was doing so late, but then remembered I was in the middle of work and resumed. The next day, I heard, thanks to you, the documents for today's presentation will be ready just in time. Always grateful to you, Brandon. I heard that the presentation you did the other day went well. Great job. Other employees, other than me, praise this every day. Just hearing words of thanks and praise made all the hard work feel worthwhile. I'm honored to be of help, I said. With such positive feedback, I was able to start my workday with great motivation. I wanted to thank everyone else as much as they thanked me. Then you should leave on time once in a while. I know you have a lot of work, but remember that taking breaks is also part of the job, said Jason. Heeding his advice, I decided to leave early for once. Thinking of going home early, I sent a text message to my parents. Can I come over today? I'm getting off work on time for a change. The reply came quicker than expected. Of course. It's been a while, so I'll cook your favorite dishes and wait for you. Thinking of having a delicious meal instead of a ready-made one tonight made me even more motivated, and I was able to focus more than usual on my work. I thought I had done enough not to trouble anyone, and when I looked at the clock, it was just past the regular closing time. Quickly preparing to leave, I greeted the remaining employees and was about to exit the company when Michael stopped me. Leaving now? You always work late, don't you? He said in his usual sarcastic tone. Yes, I've finished the minimum required tasks for today, so I'll be leaving now. I responded with a smile, not letting Michael's sarcasm bother me. However, Michael didn't seem amused. Who said you could leave? As he said this, I heard the sound of papers falling and turned around to see Michael had knocked all the documents off my desk. Oops, my bad. Seems like my hand slipped. Looking at Michael's face, he was grinning, and it was obvious he did it on purpose. Oopsie. I accidentally stepped on them. I picked them up quickly. He deliberately stepped on the fallen documents and left with a loud, crude laugh. I was genuinely worried and quickly started picking up the papers. Employees who had witnessed the whole thing helped me, and we managed to gather all the documents. But it was clear they needed sorting as various papers were mixed up. "We'll handle this, Brandon. Just go home, man. Michael is so immature." My colleagues, concerned for me, urged me to leave, but there were too many documents, and they would end up working overtime. "Thanks, but I'm fine. I'll do it and go home." "You all have other work, right?" I said with a smile, but they insisted on helping. Thanks to them, we finished much faster than expected. However, when I checked the time, it was already 2 hours past the regular closing time, and I had several worried messages from my mom. I hadn't noticed because my phone was in my bag. "Sorry. Work suddenly got busy, and it's late. I'll drop by on my next day off. I'm really sorry, especially after you prepared dinner." I sighed with regret as I messaged back. "It's okay. As long as you're safe. I was worried something had happened. Come by any time." Reading my mom's reply made me feel a bit calmer, and I headed home. After the overtime incident, Michael seemed to have targeted me, and his childish harassment continued for a while. I was ordered to redo documents for being unclear, and was the only one not receiving company emails. His blatant harassment led to my colleagues often stepping in to help, but the mental strain and stress were gradually building up with the additional workload and Michael's harassment. I often worked until the last train. Then one day, while working overtime alone, Michael came again. By now, Michael was a figure of caution for me, and I felt myself tense up. "What is it?" "What do you mean? What is it? How dare you talk to me like that?" he said in his usual condescending tone. I had grown used to this kind of talk. "Do you even realize how incompetent you are? Just scraping off overtime pay." "I apologize. I'll leave now then," I said as I started to prepare to leave. Michael laughed. "No, there's no need for you to come back. Anyone who stays late and is slow at their job is just incompetent and shall be fired." Suddenly confronted with this, I stood there, unable to grasp the meaning of Michael's words. "What do you mean?" I managed to speak, my voice strained, and Michael laughed as if pleased. "I mean incompetence is a nuisance. You don't have to come back. You're fired. Don't make me say it again." Michael left the company with a loud, unpleasant laugh. "I'm fired. Left alone," I muttered to myself, unheard by anyone. After sitting dazed in the office for a while, I realized I had missed the last train and had to take a taxi home. As I looked out of the car window, I thought about the tasks I had to do tomorrow. Tomorrow, I need to prepare the contract for ABC Corporation and the presentation documents too. I have to stay late tomorrow so I can miss the last train. Is it an occupational habit? Without realizing, I started organizing my tasks for the next day in my head. Then it hit me. "Oh, that's right. I got fired," I muttered, looking at the moon. The taxi driver asked me to repeat. "It's nothing." I replied with a forced smile and got out of the taxi at my house. I was so drained that I just collapsed onto my bed. As soon as I got home, I was so tired and exhausted that, unusually, I woke up before my alarm clock went off. I usually get up at 7:00 a.m., but it was only 5:00 a.m. when I checked the time. I tried to go back to sleep, but Michael's words, "You are fired," kept echoing in my ears, preventing me from sleeping. I knew I had to start looking for a new job, but it wasn't easy to just move on. So I just lay there under the covers. As time passed, how much time had passed, I realized my phone had been ringing continuously. I picked up the phone and saw it was a colleague, but I didn't feel like answering. I gently placed the phone back down. It was past 10:00 a.m. when I checked the time. I hadn't noticed it was bright outside, as the curtains were closed. I wondered what my colleagues thought about me being fired. Were they angry? Were some of them happy? Was I as incompetent as Michael had said? The incident had broken my spirit, and I could only think negatively. I had been so devoted to my job, more than I realized, even when I was a newbie, running around to the point of nearly breaking down. Midly, I had never felt this low. Ding-dong. Lost in my thoughts, I was startled by the sudden ringing of the doorbell. Who could it be? I slowly got up and peered through the door's peephole, and so it was my father. I was momentarily surprised and hesitated to open the door. Then the doorbell rang again. With trembling hands, I slowly opened the door, and my father smiled upon seeing my face. What kind of face is that? At those words, tears started flowing, and before I knew it, they were streaming down my face. I'm coming in. Saying that, my father entered, holding a plastic bag. Seeing me in my wrinkled suit, he lifted the bag he was holding. Want to eat? You probably haven't eaten anything, right? So my father knew. I felt so pathetic. He entered the room and opened the curtains. Immediately, perhaps it was because I had been in a dark room for a while, the sunlight felt unusually bright, perhaps brighter than usual. The company called. They said you weren't answering your phone, so they contacted our home. What happened? I explained the whole situation to my father. He listened, nodding along as I spoke. So, what do you want to do now? Asked my father. I was unable to gather my thoughts and could only hang my head. What should I do now? What should I be thinking? How should I act? See me like this, my father began to speak. Don't deny yourself just because others do. What's important is not what you should do, but what you want to do. People's words can sometimes be sharper than a blade, right? But don't let such people mislead you about your own worth. Nobody can truly determine another person's value. You've done well. Stand tall and be proud. Hearing my father's words, I found myself crying again. My father patted my back reassuringly. Let's have some food. It's your mom's cooking. If we don't eat, I'll get scolded by her. The thought made me chuckle a little. I had finally managed to smile. I ate the meal prepared by my mother with my father. Her cooking was as delicious as ever. I had lost my appetite since yesterday, but once I started eating, I was surprised at how hungry I actually was. Hunger doesn't let the mind focus. Forward for now, just eat well and rest. Things will surely look up. I never thought that at this age I would be comforted by my father. Perhaps age doesn't matter in a family. If my father hadn't come, I would probably still be in bed, not eating, not moving, just spiraling in negative thoughts. Feeling full helped me start looking forward again. After finishing the meal, my father said, "You can always come back home." And then he left my place. Sitting on my bed after he left, I began to think about the future. Even if I was as incompetent as Michael said, I wasn't satisfied with how things ended. I don't demand recognition for my hard work, but I refuse to believe that everything I did was in vain. After all, it was Michael who announced my dismissal. What would Mr. Johnson think about this? It felt unsatisfying to just leave things as they were. Acknowledging Michael's actions, I wanted to retaliate, even if in a small way. While I was thinking, my phone rang again. Looking at the display, it was another colleague. After hesitating, I decided to answer. Hello? As soon as I answered, I heard my colleague's loud voice. Finally, you answered. You got fired. What's going on? Exactly what I wanted to know. I told my colleague about last night's incident with Michael. What? That's crazy. Michael? You should have talked back. Strangely, my colleague was indignant on my behalf. It was a bit amusing to see him angry for me, but it also felt touching. I asked my colleague what happened at the office today and how the employees were reacting. His story wandered a bit, but the gist of it was this. In the morning assembly, a few employees noticed my absence and were discussing contacting me when Michael overheard and laughed, saying I was fired. When asked why, he refused to say, citing it as personal information. What kind of personal information is that? My colleagues and superiors, suspecting unfair dismissal due to Michael's involvement, planned to consult Mr. Johnson, but he was on a business trip. They decided to speak with Mr. Johnson as soon as he returned from his trip, but many were concerned about me and had tried calling. I was about to go to your house if you didn't respond even by tomorrow. Hearing the story from my colleague, I realized again how fortunate I was with my workplace relationships. Thank you. I'm glad to hear it. As I said this, my colleague panicked, misunderstanding my tone. What's with that ominous remark? You're not thinking of doing something drastic, are you? I couldn't help but laugh at his words. It's not funny. Seriously, what are you going to do now? Right. What am I going to do regarding my dismissal? I need to understand the company's stance, so talking to Mr. Johnson is essential. But I didn't want to let Michael have the last word. While thinking, something occurred to me. What's happening with my work? Yesterday, I left work without finishing my tasks. There were documents I was supposed to use today. I feel irresponsible, but I'm curious to know what happened. Well, actually, I wanted to talk to you about that too. The documents we were supposed to use today, you had mostly prepared them, right? All that was left was a detailed part of the contract translation into French. Other employees were trying to complete it, but then Michael suddenly said, I'll do it. Hearing this, I was surprised because Michael was known for pushing work onto others, but never doing it himself. So Michael ended up doing it. It was finished just in time, and we hurriedly sent it to the client by email. But remember that time when Michael did a translation and it was a mess? We were also worried. Previously, Michael had claimed, I can handle French, and prepared the contract in French, but it resulted in a complaint from the client. This was before I joined the team, so I hadn't seen it myself, but long-standing employees told me it was a big issue, and that worry became a reality. What? My colleague explained what happened today. It seems something like this happened. Michael, there's a call from a foreign company. I could only catch your name, but couldn't understand the rest. Sorry, should I transfer the call to you? Come on. Learn to speak French. Just transfer it. Michael answered a call and said in poor French, Hi, I'm Michael. How are you? One more time. Again? Again? Is that even real French? Why, angry contract? What? Sorry, hello. He spoke in what seemed to be French, but then he said they hung up. What did they say? Oh, they said they wanted the contract. No problem. That's definitely a lie. Later, another call came in, and an employee who understood a bit of French responded. The client was furious, saying the contract was so poorly done it was unacceptable, as if we were picking a fight. That contract had been prepared by Michael in French. Who's in charge of this? Get them to solve it. He got fired yesterday. He was the only one who could speak French. What? I sighed after hearing my colleague's explanation. I haven't seen the contents of the contract, but the fact that they were so upset is proof that it must have been pretty shoddy, and Michael's handling of it just made things worse. It feels like pouring gasoline on the fire. It must have been tough. I'm sorry. It was my job. I couldn't think of anything else to say. I wondered if there was anything I could do, but then I remembered I was no longer in a position to be involved. I realized my dismissal was causing trouble for my colleagues. I was plagued with guilt. It's not your fault, Brandon. Your workload was already too much. It's our responsibility too for not being able to support you. Actually, is it Michael to blame? I felt comforted by my colleague's words and found myself wanting to return to the company. Even if I decide to leave, I still want to talk to Mr. Johnson. According to my colleague, Mr. Johnson will be back from his trip in 2 days. I decided to prepare what I would discuss with him. For now, I needed to collect my belongings from the office, so I informed my colleague that I would be coming by tomorrow. He said he would let the supervisor know, and we ended the call. The next day, I went to the company to get my things. Despite being familiar with the route from years of commuting, I felt nervous. Today, when I arrived at the company, my colleagues gathered around, showing their concern for me. Jason said, "I'm sorry I couldn't be of help." Looking frustrated, I told him that it wasn't his fault and assured my colleagues that I was fine. When I mentioned I came to collect my belongings, their expressions turned complex. They seriously considered if there was any way for me to return, showing that they valued my presence. While talking, Michael approached and looked displeased upon seeing me. "Why are you here? This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." "I just came to collect my belongings that I left here. I'll be leaving soon." As I headed towards my desk, Michael loudly called out from behind, "Good timing. Take responsibility for your work before you leave." I turned around at that line. Could he be trying to pin yesterday's incident on me? "What do you mean?" As I asked, Michael smirked. "Your half-finished contract caused an uproar with a foreign client. Take responsibility." Michael, oblivious to the appalled expressions around him, continued to blame me. I wondered how far he would go to cause trouble. Just as my anger was reaching its limit, enough. Already a familiar voice spoke, and I turned to see Mr. Johnson standing there. Mr. Johnson's unexpected return from his business trip surprised everyone in the office. He was supposed to come back tomorrow. I could see the panic wash over Michael as he faced Mr. Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, you were scheduled to return tomorrow," Michael stammered, visibly agitated. Mr. Johnson sighed. "I came back early after hearing about the trouble. So, what's all this commotion about?" His anger was palpable, and the office fell silent. Even though I had been fired, I wanted to talk to Mr. Johnson. This seemed like the perfect opportunity, but it didn't feel like the right time to speak up. Shouldn't someone explain the situation and seek guidance? But as someone who had just been let go, I felt it wasn't my place to say anything. Amid the loud ticking of the clock, Mr. Johnson broke the silence. "What's this commotion about? Tell me." Michael, now visibly unsettled, took a deep breath. "This guy here made a sloppy contract that led to a complaint from a foreign client. I was just lecturing him about it. He always works late, and I thought maybe he was doing it on purpose to increase his overtime pay, so I fired him yesterday. I told him to take responsibility for this mess before he quits." As Michael presented his case, I felt a renewed contempt for him. It was clear he was trying to absolve himself of any blame. I considered this my chance to explain my side, but I hesitated. Just as I was about to take a gamble and speak up, Mr. Johnson intervened. "Is that so? Then Brandon, come to my office." Tension surged through me, but this was an opportunity for a private conversation with Mr. Johnson. I followed him into his office, leaving my belongings on my desk. Inside, Mr. Johnson opened the window, and a silent pressure filled the air, making it difficult for me to speak. I wondered if I was going to be reprimanded, bombarded with questions, or even faced with discussions about damages or compensation. The atmosphere made me think the worst was coming. Let me tell you a story from about 20 years ago, before this company was founded. Mr. Johnson began unexpectedly. I was surprised, taking in the change in his demeanor. He spoke with a gentle smile. "Back then, I worked at a regular corporation. I was about your age, struggling with my work, and my boss didn't like me. I was on the verge of giving up. Then a senior colleague told me, 'Don't let anyone else's disapproval bring you down. You're doing great. Stand tall and be proud.'" I was struck by Mr. Johnson's words. They sounded familiar. "Those words," I murmured. Mr. Johnson laughed heartily. "How's your dad doing?" I was stunned. "You know my father." Mr. Johnson continued, "Your father's words inspired me to persevere and eventually establish this company. In a way, he's my benefactor. When you joined the company, he contacted me asking me to look after his son. I didn't reveal our connection to prevent you from becoming complacent or feeling pressured. I hope you understand. Before I knew it, Mr. Johnson's kindness eased my tension, and I felt a sense of happiness. I realized I had been looked after all this time. Yes, thank you so much, I replied, overwhelmed. Regarding the recent matter, I reviewed the documents and contract you sent to the client on my way back to the office. It was clearly made by someone else, so I know you weren't the cause. As for Michael firing you, I won't let that happen. If you're willing, I want you to continue working with us. What do you say? Mr. Johnson's understanding and support filled me with relief and renewed confidence. Of course. Please let me keep working here, I replied, happiness washing over me. Mr. Johnson smiled. That's a good response. I apologize for making you feel anxious and uncomfortable. It wasn't my intention. I flustered. It's not your fault. I never wanted you to apologize. Mr. Johnson chuckled. Why are you apologizing? You haven't done anything wrong. I've heard about your good work. I want you here, not because of my debt to your father, but because you're a capable employee. Please understand that. His words touched me deeply, and I felt my eyes welling up with tears. Perhaps it was the emotional strain of the day. Mr. Johnson, sensing my vulnerability, said I could leave, and I exited his office. When I stepped out, all eyes were on me. It seemed I had caused quite a stir. I smiled and gave a thumbs up, and my colleagues cheered with joy. A coworker patted my shoulder, saying they were glad for me. My tears were slightly visible, but when they teased me about crying, I retorted that I wasn't. I was smiling. Suddenly, amidst the excitement, I heard a yelling voice. No way. Michael stood with wide eyes and an angry expression. How is this possible? Are you staying? What about your responsibility regarding the overtime pay? I decided you were fired. Michael's fury no longer intimidated me. I ignored him as I chatted with my colleagues. His anger intensified as he marched toward me. Don't ignore me. I'm the department head. We don't need someone like you. Get out now. Just then, Mr. Johnson emerged from his office, having overheard Michael's shouts. What's going on? What about his responsibility for the client incident? Michael continued to shout angrily at Mr. Johnson. You haven't reversed his firing, have you? We all watched nervously. You don't have the authority to fire an employee. Wasn't it you who messed up the contract? Mr. Johnson spoke calmly, halting Michael's momentum. Michael's head hung low as he began to tremble. I don't understand what you mean. I didn't do anything. I'm not involved, he stammered, still trying to deny his faults. His audacity was impressive, but it was not enviable. Surprisingly, another employee spoke up. That contract was made by Michael, I'm sure. To my surprise, one employee stepped forward to testify, leading the charge. Other employees chimed in, recounting instances of Michael's mishandling. I heard Michael ordering the contract to be sent by email, one said. I heard him trying to communicate with the client in French, which he couldn't speak properly. Michael was taken aback by the successive testimonies. When he shouted, "Shut up!" the room fell silent, the disdain for him palpable. Michael, why don't you just accept it gracefully? You're making a bad situation worse. I said, but Michael turned red with anger. It was nothing but a tantrum as he kept insisting he was not at fault. However, we have surveyed footage and computer data history that clearly show your involvement. So no matter what you say, you're fired, Mr. Johnson stated. Struck by the final blow, Michael froze momentarily before crumbling to his knees, finally silent. He muttered, "This wasn't supposed to happen." You'll receive a formal notice later. Go home for today, Mr. Johnson concluded. Eventually, Michael gathered his things and left, dejected. The matter was resolved, and it turned out Michael was a distant relative of Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson had been asked to look after him because he couldn't hold down a job. Michael had taken credit for others' work and had been promoted to department head. Mr. Johnson admitted it was his responsibility for not seeing through it and expressed the need for self-reflection. After losing his job, Michael entered a self-destructive phase and resorted to gambling. Soon, he couldn't pay his rent and was evicted. In a panic, he found a job in a dormitory, but the shared bathroom and thin walls made it tough, especially with noise complaints. As for me, I returned to work the next day, greeted by my colleagues with a welcome-back gift of a pile of work, just as I expected. But now, I was happy to be busy again. While I was getting into the swing of things, Mr. Johnson came by and limited my overtime to 3 days a week. When I asked why, he mentioned that my father had expressed concern, asking if I was working too much overtime. I felt a bit dismayed to have my father involved at my age, but I knew he was concerned about me. With reduced overtime, I started visiting my parents more often. My mother and brother, worried about the recent events, treated me as if nothing had happened, which I greatly appreciated. I later found out that Mr. Johnson and my mother were childhood acquaintances. My father had calmed her down when she wanted to complain to him about the recent incident and the overtime. Once more, my father had stepped in to stop my brother from acting against Michael. I felt fortunate, albeit perhaps a little overly protective, after realizing how many people were on my side throughout the entire ordeal. I eventually started a new connection after taking on the role of training supervisor for a recently hired female colleague. My life gained another significant individual, and I now strive to be a person who protects others. I currently live my life in that manner.